Welcome to FO Talks. I'm Kent Jenkins. I'm delighted to be here today with my friend Paul Eckert. Paul has written an important new book called Healing Middle Class Democracy, Respecting Each Other, Cooperating Fairly, and Sharing Opportunity. The book gives us Paul's insights into one of the critical issues shaping politics and economics in the U.S. and around the world. Paul has been studying and experiencing the concerns of middle-class Americans for decades. A native of small-town Indiana, he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard University and earned a PhD from Michigan State University. He is deeply immersed in the ways of Washington, D.C., where he held a variety of positions in government, business, and in nonprofits. And as he'll explain, Paul has his own firsthand experience with issues he explores in his book. So welcome, Paul, and congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Ken.
Great. Let's get to it. Paul, you argue that the U.S. middle class is in serious economic and social trouble. So much trouble that it's actually in danger of splitting apart. And that breakup would pose serious risks for the future of American democracy. Could you start by telling us who makes up the middle class and how life for those Americans is changing?
Well, that's a great question. I think that is the right place to start because there are lots of different ways of defining middle class. People use the word all the time. You can define it in terms of things like education. Do you have a college degree or not? Culture, knowledge of arts and humanities. Most definitions deal with economics, but not in the same way. So, for example, you can look at income, wealth, purchasing power. You can look at regional variations between, say, southern Alabama and upstate New York. But what I'd like to do is just talk about wealth, and without getting into all the details of how that is measured, it includes income and assets minus debts. And so when we think about that, the first thing to keep in mind is really not statistics at all. And that is that the middle class, to be middle class means having to work for a living. Now, what do I mean by that? At the top, you have the wealthy who have so much that they could lose half of it and it wouldn't make a difference. They don't really have to work to support themselves. At the bottom, you have the poor who are struggling for subsistence. But in the middle, you have people who are not destitute, but who couldn't stop working for an extended period, at least through, say, the early 50s, without having a major loss in terms of their lifestyle. The second thing is to talk about what I mentioned before, which is wealth, an economic measure. And that is that most people talk in terms of the top 1%, and then everybody below that who isn't poor is middle class. But actually, what I've found is that there are two parts of the middle class that are living very different lives. There's an upper middle class and then a lower middle class. And the upper middle class, which might be, say, roughly the top 20% of the working age population, they have been doing very well, especially since 1980. But the lower middle class has not. And so just to give you an idea, the top 1%, now these are statistics, so people can dispute them, but I think that these are reasonably accurate within the last 2 or 3 years of data. Top 1% holds about 24% of the nation's wealth. The upper middle class holds about 46% of the nation's wealth. Together, they constitute 70%, leaving only 30% for everybody else, which if you subtract the poor, which is a very small percentage of national wealth, that leaves a little bit less than 30% for the lower middle class.
And Paul, if I can just interject for a moment. So you're basically saying the upper middle class is the top 20%, and then the lower middle class would be the next 60% down.
Yes, in the way I'm doing it.
Share of wealth.
Yeah, right. So you have the top 1% at the top, but that's only 1%. So let's say the 19% below them, That is roughly 20% of the working age population. And then in the middle, you have this 60%, which I'm calling lower middle class. And at the bottom 20% would be the poor.
And that's the division that you're talking about is a pretty profound shift for post-World War II America, that the interests of these groups are diverging as much as they are. So talk a little bit about how they're diverging. What does that mean if you're lower middle class that's different for you now than it might have been 30 or 40 years ago?
Right. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that from about the mid-1930s to the mid-1970s, there was what they call a great compression in the wealth distribution in the United States and in many places around the world. But our focus really with my book is the United States. And that changed significantly. Beginning in the mid-70s, a lot of people say situation in which we have an upper middle class which is far better off. Now, what does this mean in terms of practical everyday terms? I think that's really what you're asking and what everyone would be asking. So it has to do with affordability. That's a word that's on a lot of people's lips today. So let's think about 4 things that people have generally associated in America with being middle class. To be able to buy a home, to raise a family, to protect your health, and to get an education that enables you to advance in whatever pursuit in terms of career you may have chosen. Now, the upper middle class, even though things are expensive, is in good shape on all these. But the lower middle class is having increasing difficulty with every one of them. So what about housing? Yeah, go ahead.
No? Go right ahead, Paul.
Okay, I just wanted to say just briefly with regard to the 4 things that I said have characterized a middle class lifestyle, thinking of that middle period in the 20th century where so many people were moving into that. Housing, first-time buyers in many cases are shut out. Homeowners who have been able to get a mortgage, but in the lower middle class are often struggling to pay the mortgage in addition to all the other expenses that they have. The family, child rearing expenses are rising significantly, and child care is more costly than ever, so that in many urban areas around the country, lower middle class people really can't afford child care at all, which leaves them in a tough spot to be good parents, but also to hold down their jobs. Health, the premiums and expenses are going up, whatever the source of the insurance might be. And many Americans have little or no emergency funds. So if they had a major medical expense or any other kind of major expense of maybe $1,000 or more, they could not cover it without a significant disruption. They'd have to borrow the money or they'd have to give something up. And they don't have much to give up. And education, student debt is rising if people can even get the loans. And job hunting, even for people who've gotten degrees after getting into such debt, is so difficult that often people are not really able to escape a tremendous burden from this educational debt.
So you have this group of Americans that make up almost 80% of society that, again, in the post-World War II era, had a lot in common, and now economically, socially, and otherwise, that group is coming apart. And take us, if you will, to the next step of what you argue in your book, which was how does that distinction, how does that breakup, if you will, pose issues for America's democratic institutions?
Yes, and that's the linkage, because the book is titled Healing Middle Class Democracy, and there's a reason why we put those 2 terms together. So the catchphrase that I've come up with is that the middle class depends on democracy, and democracy depends on the middle class. So what does that mean? The middle class depends on democracy. Democracy is basically a way, an institutionalization of the way that people with different interests can come together through elected representatives, and they can debate, and they can decide and arrive at compromises that take everybody's interests into account. Nobody gets everything they want, but everybody gets something. No one is neglected in that process. And so in that sense, the middle class depends on democracy, because if you have an upper middle class and a lower middle class, which are living very different kinds of lives, and some things like tax policy and redistribution and all these other things that are going on impact that, then the only way that we can really come up with an arrangement in America that meets the needs of both the upper and the lower groups is to use democracy for that. And so the middle class depends on democracy. Democracy depends on the middle class because, as you said, we're talking about the majority of people in America. And if the majority of people in America don't support democracy, it will fail.
So this kind of takes us precisely to the title of the book. When you talk about healing middle class democracy and strengthening American governmental institutions. And in the title, you identify 3 separate steps that we can take to put this group, this very vital group, back together. And they are, of course, respecting each other, cooperating fairly, and sharing opportunity. And it makes sense to talk about each of these individually. So let's start with respecting each other. And I think implicit in that is the notion that middle class Americans are not treating each other respectfully now, I think. So tell us a bit about where you are on that and what we should be doing to address it.
First of all, what do I mean by respect? And why do I put that first? Respect really means that no matter what kind of work a person does, and no matter how much money they make, how much wealth they have, they're all equally valuable. That what people can respect about each other is the commitment to do the best they can with what they have, to work and to benefit from that work. And yet, part of the difficulty in America is that there's been a separation, in many cases, a physical separation between the upper and the lower middle class in this same period where the wealth has diverged so much one from the other. And so what that means is that more and more people in the upper middle class and the lower middle class don't really understand each other. And it's easy when you don't understand other people to maintain distorted and negative views of who those people are. And so the problem that many in the upper middle class have is that they look at those below them who have so much less and think, well, it's their fault. They didn't work. They didn't work as hard as I did. I deserve what I have. They don't deserve anything from me. And that's the end of it. Well, let's turn that around. People on the lower side of the income and wealth distribution may have a lot of resentment because they see the people above them as having benefited in some way, whether it was talent or parenting or whatever it may be, and it's not fair. So there's resentment. So the problem that we often have in America is that the upper middle class is condescending and critical of the lower middle class. And the lower middle class is resentful of what they feel is upper middle class arrogance. So to get beyond that requires dialogue and understanding. And the book tries to contribute to this by depicting some of what I just said. Part of the message of the book is that to the extent that people understand that everybody's working hard, everybody's ambitious, everybody wants to do the best they can, but some are able to do that and others are not, often in most cases because of circumstances beyond their control. That what respect means is that we would come together and recognize the strengths of both groups. There's tremendous value in the excellence and the competitive spirit and the aspirations of the upper middle class. And it would be a national tragedy to devalue or somehow interfere with that. There's also tremendous potential and much to be admired in the struggles of people in the lower middle class and their desire to move up. So what we have are people who could work together to be sure that those who have already achieved prosperity can keep it, and those who want to move up have a greater opportunity to do that.
And Paul, I think that takes us seamlessly into the second thing you talk about, which is cooperating fairly. And again, I just say, what do you see in our society and our institutions that are unfair or inequitable things that we need to address?
Well, first of all, I think to discuss this, just as we had to define when you talk about middle class, what do you mean? When you talk about democracy, what does that mean? What does it mean to be fair? And part of what the book addresses is that people often don't agree on what that means. And so the first step is to talk about it. Now, I turn to John Rawls, who is a famous 20th century philosopher. A few people would know the name, most would not. But many people have been exposed to his fundamental concept, his definition of fairness. He thought that justice in society was important, and the essence of justice is fairness. So how would you know what's fair? Well, his guide to what's fair was to say that everybody needs to step away from their day-to-day experience and do what he called a thought experiment. And that is to say, if you didn't know where you were going to end up in society, and you didn't know where your kids were going to end up in society, how would you organize the economy? And so it seems simple, but it's actually pretty profound, because if you might end up in the lower middle class, maybe near the poverty level, why would that happen? You might be born without as much ability, or you might have a home situation where, you know, there's substance abuse, or there's precarity where people are changing jobs, where there isn't health care. You might be in a situation where the school system is not good, where you're not nourished properly. So whether it's talent or parenting or the environment, you may have an injury that prevents you from learning effectively, or an illness, and somebody else might not have that. So in a world where all these things can happen, what would be fair? We have some people who are going to rise to a high level. They're going to achieve at a high level. Other people who are going to achieve at a relatively low level, despite all of them doing the best they can as they understand that. And so part of the issue is to accept that people are going to achieve at different levels and not try to interfere with that, but to emphasize that everybody has a responsibility to think about the welfare of everybody else. So if you happen to be on the top, then it's fair to be able to keep some of what you made. And if you happen to be on the bottom, it's fair to expect that somebody would give you help to sort of even up, to give you more opportunity than you'd have if nobody did anything. And so it's a combination of individuality and cooperation. It's a combination about equality of opportunity, but also freedom for people to pursue their own lives in their own way without being forced into some sort of uniformity or forced equality.
And Paul, I think, again, that takes us very directly to the third pillar that you cite in the book, and that is sharing opportunity. Yes.
So this is really what it comes down to, because everything in the book is really leading up to this. We talk about healing middle class democracy, respecting each other, cooperating fairly, and sharing opportunity. But it's the opportunity which is going to make the biggest difference. And everything else that I've talked about up to this point is to build a foundation for that sharing. Now, I'm not going to talk about tax rates or about particular programs. I'm not going to talk about particular parties or platforms or who is or is not a friend of democracy, because that would distract us from the basic issue. I'm just going to talk about what it means to share opportunity, and then leave it to the readers, to the people who are watching today, to decide how best to pursue this, because we all know who we can vote for. We all know what parties we can contribute to. That is everywhere. But part of the issue is what is the goal? What does it mean to share opportunity? So first of all, I want to make a distinction between a concept of redistribution of wealth and a concept of opportunity to earn a greater piece of the wealth. Opportunity is a widely shared American value. Virtually everyone you talk to would say, if you say, well, what do we owe to people? Well, we owe them an equal chance, equal opportunity. And I've described some of the things that can interfere with that in terms of life circumstances. There's another thing that Americans generally agree on, and that is that investment in something solid that's going to pay off in the future is a good idea. That people will give up some of what they could spend on frivolous things day to day in order to invest in a better future. People who can get a mortgage, people who need to pay a car loan, people who decide to go to school and give up a lot so they can afford that, or have a child and give up some of their travel and luxuries so that they can be sure that child has the best. So people know about investment and they share the value of opportunity. There's nothing wrong with a certain amount of redistribution. I'm not trying to condemn that. What I'm saying is that the emphasis in America could increasingly be on real opportunity to do better economically, as opposed to simply taking from those who have more and transferring it to those who have less without doing anything to help those who have less actually become higher earners or become more successful in terms of starting businesses or getting better jobs, upskilling, and so on. So just to move on, there are several dimensions of opportunity. And so I've talked about housing, that it should be affordable, not just to upper income people, but to everybody who's willing to work hard. There ought to be childcare, which is high quality, safe, and effective, affordable for everyone who's working. There should be healthcare, which is affordable and high quality with an emphasis on prevention, but enough there to help if something goes wrong, a serious illness or injury. And finally, education. Now, I'm going to focus on education because just as I've said, people agree on investment as being justified and people agree on opportunity as being fair. Often people see education as a key part of increasing opportunity and giving people a fair chance. So what do I mean by education? Well, there's a pipeline. We need to look at education from the beginning, which is preschool, all the way up through post-secondary education. So that includes high quality, affordable preschool for everyone in America, every child in America, and a good quality elementary education, high school education, community college for those who are focused on getting skills for a particular trade or career. Four-year college, yes, but that's not the only thing. And for many people, it won't be the most important thing in terms of helping them support themselves by starting a business or getting a job and paying for the things for them and their children that are important. And so there are two or three things I'd like to say beyond that. What does it mean for education to help people do better in terms of their earning capacity? Well, first of all, vocational education from elementary on helps give people the kinds of skills that you need to succeed in any job, not just in being college prep or not, but to succeed in a skilled trade or to be a good teacher at the elementary level or whatever. Entrepreneurship, people need to know, what does it mean to start a business, to get financing, to deal with legal and regulatory issues, to hire people, to focus on your business plan in the market. And then another thing, which is artificial intelligence, is a great challenge. And there's a lot of debate about whether it will create more jobs or less jobs, it will destroy jobs, and who will benefit. But one thing we can see is that there will be a transition. And education can help people who are displaced by AI retrain for the kinds of skills that they'll need to do well in the new emerging economy. So we don't restrain innovation, we help people adjust. And this should be a partnership between the companies who know what they need and the schools and the students and the parents. Please.
And Paul, I think that's an interesting pivot point because when we look at AI, a lot of the problems of workplace dislocation that the lower middle class has been facing may suddenly be facing the upper middle class now, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the future. But I want to pivot a bit and talk not just about the book, but about you. It's a very interesting and weighty subject, and one that not everybody would connect with. So why'd you write this book? What personally drew you to it?
Well, I grew up, as you pointed out, in small towns in Indiana. I was born in Illinois, but at the ripe old age of 1 year, our family moved to Indiana, and I was in the lower middle class. I had two highly educated parents, but we did not have money. And part of that was that my father made a decision to become a minister, Presbyterian minister, and he had to give up a lot in order to pay for seminary, his education, while he was also supporting himself with a full-time pastorate as in a small Indiana town, and he moved through various stages in that career. But the point is, I saw the high value of people in the lower middle class because that's where I and my parents were. And I saw so many people who didn't have a lot of money, and they weren't on top. They weren't sophisticated, but they cared about each other, and they worked hard, and they pulled themselves up, and they made the world a better place. Part of the concern that I had, which led me to write the book, is that whereas in 1950, there was a very good chance that somebody born in America in a lower income level could move up significantly, and their children as well. That's changed. It's still possible, but it's not nearly as common as it was. So that's the first thing. I grew up in the lower middle class. Secondly, when I went off to Harvard, which was sort of a shock to everyone that I would be accepted, but it happened. I experienced the shock of a lower middle class person moving into a very upper middle class environment. There were other lower middle class students who also came from the Midwest, but there were a lot of other students who did not have that background. They came from prep schools, they came from money, they knew how to play the game, and they played it better than those of us who didn't have that background. So I experienced that. And then I pursued psychology as a career, as an administrator, as an organizational leader, and also as a clinician. And I did that in the Detroit area. And as you know, this was in the early 1980s and the mid to late 1980s. There was a tremendous shock because of foreign competition in the auto industry, and also there was a growing tendency to work against the power of unions. And so for all those reasons, there was a lot of economic hardship for people, and people moving out of the comfortable middle class into the bottom edge or even into poverty, communities being destroyed because of the loss of jobs and so on and so forth. So I saw what was happening when there was a wealthy group of people in the country who had priorities that did not match the needs of everyday Americans. And yet I understand the reasons for both sides of this equation, the people who were on the side of economic growth and the people who were losing out because of those changes. Then I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. And as you mentioned, I had a variety of positions in various federal agencies with a big company, and continued some of my nonprofit work. But I moved out of psychology into politics and public policy, both international and domestic. And that taught me a lot about how things get done or don't get done in Washington. And that strengthened my sense. If part of what my book is about is lower versus upper middle class, part of it's about democracy and how it works or doesn't work, and how it's always vulnerable to either being attacked from the outside by people who want to destroy it, or people who are depending on democracy, not realizing how much they need it. And so that brought me to where I am today.
And one of the very refreshing things about the book when you read it is that the ideas that you're talking about here are not something you picked up from somebody's social media post or today's news cycle. They're really deeply rooted in history and philosophy. And I was wondering if you could touch briefly, you mentioned John Rawls earlier, but if you could just touch briefly on some of the thinkers that have influenced you and helped you develop the ideas that are in this book.
Well, yes, thanks for that, because the book is a mix of focus on today and focus on the past. Not in terms of worshiping the past, but to try to avoid being caught up in just the ebb and flow, the constant change, acceleration of change that we all encounter. So I addressed history and philosophy in two ways. The first was that I wanted to look back to the recent past. And in the case of one of these individuals, he just passed away last month. But the others were basically of the 20th century. And even the individual who just passed away he did his most important, most influential work in the 20th century. So recent enough to be relevant, but stepping back a little from today's events. The first was John Dewey. He lived from 1859 to 1952, almost a century. And he focused on respect. He went back to the ancient Greeks and Romans and dealt with many different aspects of the history of culture, society, and so on. And he said that fundamentally we've had a bias in Western civilization in favor of knowledge people, knowledge workers, and against people who work with their hands. It's ebbed and flowed, but he felt this was the case. And so for him, mutual respect was fundamental to recognize the equal value of everyone. Then secondly, Jürgen Habermas, who is German. He lived from 1929 to, as I said, 2026. He died at the age of 96 just last month. And he was in the Hitler Youth in Germany for the first few years of his life. He from 1929 to 1945, so he was roughly 16 when the war ended. He was a product of that culture, and yet, as with so many others who participated in that, his family values and his personal values did not line up with the regime, but he certainly was very familiar with what had happened in that country and experienced it. So his professional development came in the immediate post-war years when Germany was going through denazification, occupied by Allied powers, the Eastern occupied by the Soviet Union, and the other parts of Germany divided up. Heavy American influence, heavy influence of an effort to root out and prevent the recurrence of something like Nazism that had resulted in so much bloodshed and cruelty for years. And so what he did was to fuse together what he felt were the best insights from American culture and philosophy with the best insights that he drew from European, especially German philosophy. And he emphasized the importance of communication, good faith, honest communication as a basis for democracy, that's necessary to enable democracy. And that's what had broken down in the rise of Nazism and the collapse of democratic government in Germany and elsewhere. And so even though negotiation is not a term that he originally used because he thought that was about being strategic, where you just try to get what you can and not think about the others, later in his career, he emphasized that even though we might have an ideal situation where people are not really negotiating to get something, they're just debating principles, he arrived at a sense that negotiation is critical in a democratic society for people to, in a good faith and honest manner, work for compromises that benefit everyone. And that's why he's so important to healing middle-class democracy. And finally, John Rawls, who I already mentioned, so I won't go into great detail. He lived from 1921 to 2002, and his whole emphasis was on defining fairness in terms of a social contract. That when I said the foundation of his approach was that you don't know where you're going to end up, You don't know where your kids are going to end up. So you better organize society so that it's fair to everybody, wherever they may appear in this distribution of who gets what. He elaborated that in such an effective way that many people say he, more than anyone else in the 20th century, helped define what political philosophy means and how it applies to the organization of society. And so his concept of fairness is really, of all the three, the most important foundation of healing middle-class democracy. I'll just mention briefly that those who read the book will also find some attention to the precursors, because Dewey, Habermas, and Rawls all looked back to times before their own, to some extent with contemporaries, but mostly before their own. They looked to ancient Greece and Rome, to Plato and Aristotle, Xenophon, Cicero, and others. They looked at the social contract theorists from the 17th century on, Hobbes, Locke, and so on. And especially for Habermas, there was a great attention to the social and economic criticism of the 19th and 20th centuries, who involved people like Karl Marx, George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, and others. So these 20th century philosophers brought together so much of Western civilization to focus on issues that are directly relevant to healing middle-class democracy and bringing the upper and the lower middle class back together.
Paul, it's again, and this takes us, I think, to one other aspect of the book I wanted to chat with you about, and that's the tone. It's been a while, I think, since I've seen Aristotle and Xenophon mentioned on social media. Politics in the United States and most Western democracies these days is a kind of a nasty, mean-spirited sort of thing, unfortunately. But all the way through this book, you don't take sides, call names, or even raise your voice. That's a pretty optimistic approach by today's standards. And talk a little bit about why that's the route you wanted to go.
Well, we don't have any lack of people who are taking partisan positions on the left or the right. We certainly don't have any lack of people who are expressing admiration or contempt for particular political leaders. And so what I wanted to do was to give people something else, a different perspective, to step back from all of that and to talk about principles, to talk about values, separate from the ebb and flow of the discussion and debate, the mudslinging and the polarization. Now, this could be naive and it could be irrelevant. Naive in the sense that I'm pretending that somehow people could actually step back from their conflicts and think about values, or that even if they did that it would do any good, it would make any difference. And this is an issue that Dewey and Habermas and Rawls all struggled with, not just me and others like me today. And so there's something called ideal theory. And what ideal theory is, in philosophical terms, is it's a statement of how things should be or ought to be. It's an ideal state. Now, is that valuable to share with people who don't live in an ideal world and can't create an ideal world? They said, and I say, yes. These three philosophers and I think many of the ancients and those throughout our history of Western civilization would agree, it is valuable for people to have ideals for two reasons. It gives us a reference point by which we can judge what we're trying to do. And the second is it gives us inspiration to help us keep trying to make the world a better place, even when the details of day-to-day life are discouraging and difficult. And we need to have hope and a sense of what a world would be like if it were better and how we could contribute.
And Paul, again, the book has so much, and I really enjoyed reading it, but I wonder if there are just one or two key thoughts that you'd like to end with.
Yes, thank you for that. I want to step back and sum up some of the things that I've said as briefly as possible. So middle-class people who are joined together by the fact that they all have to work for a living could unite to protect the prosperity of those who have already done well while increasing everyone else's chance of moving up. And so what would make that possible? Investing in opportunity, investing as opposed to just redistributing, and opportunity as opposed to just, doing something short term, would increase lower middle class ability to benefit from their hard work, while also honoring the achievements of those in the upper middle class who have already benefited from that. And one of the ways that we can invest in opportunity is to invest in education. There are many other things like childcare and healthcare and housing and so forth that are very important. But because I couldn't deal with everything, I wanted to deal with something that almost every American agrees on. Education is a good thing. Education should be the result of and benefit from hard work, and it should increase economic opportunity, as well as all its other values. But as I have implied throughout all these remarks, another thing that education can do is to teach people how to cooperate. That's not the same thing as technical skill or job skill. It teaches people how to get together in a group, how to take everybody's needs into account, how to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and see the world as they see it. And all this contributes to two things about democracy: citizenship, voting and participating, and leadership for some from the lower middle class as well as the upper middle class to move up into positions of leadership because they have extraordinary ability to offer. And yet that should always be disciplined by the value of public service, that leaders lead for the benefit of those who are in the society, not for themselves. And that is the essence of public service. So democracy is the only option we have in America to work out equitable compromises that will take into account protecting wealth and also increasing the opportunity of people to gain wealth. And how would this work? I just want to emphasize productivity. I think you've seen me sort of moving in that direction, but I want to hit it right on the head as we close. If you take all the unrealized potential of the lower middle class and you give people access to education and all the other things that make opportunity real, this could unleash a tremendous upsurge in productivity in America, which could increase our overall wealth at the same time that it gives people at the lower levels a chance to get a bigger part of that wealth without taking it away from people at the top. And that's what democracy can enable us to do, and there is no authoritarian alternative to it. We have to work together in a democratic way to be sure that everyone benefits from our society. And that, in my final words, I'd like to say the American dream can be just a hopeless fantasy or an empty aspiration. It can also be a reality. And healing middle-class democracy, respecting each other, cooperating fairly, and sharing opportunity can help more Americans than ever before achieve the American dream.
Paul Eckert, thanks for being here today. This is a great discussion. Once again, the book is called Healing Middle Class Democracy, Respecting Each Other, Cooperating Fairly, and Sharing Opportunity. It's published by Real Clear Publishing, and it's available on Amazon. I'm Kent Jenkins. Thanks for joining us on FO Talks.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.